Welcome back to Telco Talk right here on CNBC Africa. Before the break, we were discussing the costs involved with telepresence and why it is economically viable to embark on this technology down the line. Stanton, we were talking about this a little earlier. Tell us about the costs involved in your mind. Do you think that it's an investment worth it?
I think definitely there has to be a valid return on investment that needs to be put forward. I think every organization needs to evaluate that from a costing point of view. I think most organizations where we've been involved directly have showed a positive influence in terms of the calculators driving the sales for real presence or telepresence in this regard. And all of which having a direct impact in terms of total cost of ownership. Bandwidth, as an example, is a commodity that everybody is hunting for. Yeah. In the Polycom world, we call them the bandwidth hunters. No disregard to Ted, with solutions that are in place today, with total cost of ownership, return on investment, bandwidth commodity needs to be taken into consideration.
Obviously, that is also a big cost. Shahab, could we get a comment from you on that? And just also the costs involved in setting up the technology that you've rolled out in Kenya.
I would like just also to add to what the Neotel colleague was alluding to. So I think when we talk about the cost, I think we need to take into consideration what really the telepresence is being used for. And I think looking at the different application and the platform which you can use, you can completely have a different return on investment. I mean, internally, just taking the example of Cisco, internally we have achieved $766 million of cost saving within 1 year. That was last year, yeah. Which is tremendous. And I think, if you look at the other aspects in terms of, where you can increase really the productivity, for example, reducing sales cycles, but engaging with the customer much faster, or actually, saving the internal operation costs, access to the subject matter experts and other areas, the cost becomes really negligible. But again, it comes really down to what kind of, application do you want to use telepresence for? Okay, so that's the first thing. In terms of the costing, of course, similar to what the Neotel colleague was talking about. So between the boardroom application and the single desktop type of telepresence application, which is coming to Cisco through the Tandberg acquisition about 2 years ago. So we have seen a complete drop of the cost and the application of the telepresence at not only at the high-end level, but at the mid-range and the low-end, by having a completely open system, which is interoperable with any kind of video conferencing, and makes the telepresence absolutely reachable and accessible from every device, and ultimately the costs come down tremendously. Yeah.
Well, with your launch of your telepresence solutions in Kenya, tell us about how much money was invested and when you think you're going to see your return on investment.
Well, the investment which was done, if that's what you're talking about in the public rooms, that was done by Safaricom, so I don't have the exact figures, but I think it's the typical size of investment you do between $250,000 to $500,000 in terms of depending on the number of the locations and the different range of telepresence you do. Mm-hmm. In terms of the return on investment or the amortization, we've seen, again, I can talk about Cisco internal, we've seen a return on investment within 9 months. Which is actually pretty attractive, and of course in other cases where the number of the travels is actually much higher, and the number of the people coming together is increasing, so you see actually even shorter amortization period up to 6 months. So it really depends on the configuration of the setup and ultimately the utilization of the technology.
Ted, I see you agreeing there.
It's a very interesting point, because when you start off and you try and build a business case that says this is why you should be using telepresence, and how long will it take to get the return, what we've seen with customers that have taken telepresence in South Africa for their own private use is after the first or second telepresence room that they put in, their business productivity increases and they start to use it more and more, which brings their organization, whether it's just in South Africa or into the UK or down into Australia or wherever it may be, far closer from an operating entity. And subsequently, they then start justifying the use of the equipment and the technology as a business tool, as a daily business tool. So you have to then surmise that if they're making that decision, they're starting to see the benefits and they're getting the return and certainly the return in their business, driving the uptake.
We were talking about bandwidth, and Stanton alluded to it, a very rare commodity in South Africa. It is getting better, but how much hinges on that? How much of the growth in the telepresence scenario could play out if we don't see an increase in bandwidth in South Africa?
Well, I think we're at the point now where we've got the bandwidth that we need. You need a fair amount of bandwidth, anything from probably, if we're talking technology, probably down at about 4 megabits to 20 megabits of bandwidth. Now, that's an inordinate amount of bandwidth compared to what we were used to. But the cost of that has come down such that it's readily available, it's affordable from a business perspective, and you know, you can reuse it, so it's not dedicated to a single individual, and that's really the beauty of having a telecommunications company that provides it as a messaging exchange, because you get commodities and, you know, of scale by sharing that bandwidth.
It's interesting, some of the research I've done, they say that video conferencing systems typically operate on 384 kilobytes per second, and then looking at video conferencing high definition 2 megabytes per second, so obviously you would require more bandwidth to use telepresence.
If I can add in on that, I think that has basically over the last 2 years with the enhancement of software compression has dropped significantly. As an example, in the Polycom world, you'd be able to do a high definition call at 512K instead of 2 megs on a traditional video conferencing endpoint. On the telepresence component, you'd be able to do HD calls, which is basically using 2 codecs for about 1.5 meg per telepresence stream.
Well, those are interesting scenarios as well. Shahab, looking at what we're seeing coming through in East Africa, and as we mentioned earlier, the cable has changed the scenarios as well quite extensively. You were talking about sales success rates increasing, employees and executives becoming far more productive. What about CO2 emissions as well? Something we actually haven't touched on. Your view on this?
This is something I think, you know, we need also to look at because again, you know, we have seen, you know, from a bandwidth point of view, we are using actually for the moment the Tandberg solution on the high definition, you know, 256 kilobit, and then going up to, you know, to the full board size room, you know, up to 15 megabit. Okay, so that's actually, and with the cost of the bandwidth dropping dramatically, I think we will see, you know, that the total cost of ownership will improve even better. But I think again, you know, we should always take the cost as just one component into consideration, and I think this is really what the user has to understand, you know, is a completely change of the way of communication and collaboration within the organization, so which ultimately will pay off over a period of time. There is, of course, always an immediate, you know, return and cost cutting associated with, but ultimately the biggest effect is about, you know, how you change the way you operate within the organization and without the organization in terms of, you know, collaborating with your customers, with your suppliers, partners, etc., etc.
Where do you think it's all going to end up, Stanton? I mean, do you think that face-to-face meetings are going to be a thing of the past?
I don't think visual communications as such is going to replace that. I think there's always a need to shake someone's hand or give them a hug as an example, or share a beer. But I think it's definitely going to increase the frequency and the medium of meetings that are taking place, increase the profile of those meetings in the sense that with technology that's out there today, as an example, Eye Connect, you'd be able to look at someone straight in the eye as if they were sitting across the table. And that is a phenomenal tool in the sense that there and then you'd be able to get accountability, or you'd be able to see the fear in one's eyes and basically take it from there, you know. So the technology, I think, has evolved quite a bit in leaps and bounds. I think it's probably going to get to a stage where 3D, 4D holograms, or even almost visualizations of people coming through beams, as in Star Trek as an example, have those type of communication. I think it will continually evolve, but not replace the face-to-face contingent.
That sounds very exciting. Gentlemen, thank you so very much for joining me today. A big thank you to Shahab Meshki from Cisco East Africa, and of course to Stanton Naidoo from Polycom, and Ted Wood coming to us from Neotel.